Sometimes, the saddest cries come from the smallest hearts. At exactly 2:13 in the morning, Emily Carter suddenly woke up to a sound so sharp and desperate that it sent a chill through her entire apartment. At first, she thought a smoke detector battery had died somewhere in the building, but then she heard it again. A tiny, trembling cry. Long broken. Almost human. Emily threw off her blanket and stumbled into the dark hallway of her small Chicago apartment, her heart pounding as the sound echoed through the living room. The crying didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic. "Oliver," she whispered nervously as she reached for the lamp beside the couch. The warm yellow light flickered on, revealing the tiny orange kitten crouched near the front door. His entire little body was shaking violently. His ears were flattened against his head, and his wide blue eyes were locked on the door as if he expected something terrifying to come through it at any second. Then the kitten let out another cry. Loud, painful, desperate. Emily rushed toward him and carefully scooped him into her arms, but Oliver immediately twisted and clawed his way back down onto the carpet. He ran straight back to the door and started crying again. Emily had only adopted Oliver 3 days earlier from a temporary animal shelter outside the city. The shelter volunteer had told her he was shy but sweet, just 8 weeks old, rescued after a severe storm damaged part of an apartment complex nearby. At the time, Oliver had seemed quiet and nervous, but nothing unusual. Nothing like this. Emily knelt beside him slowly. Hey, you're okay," she whispered softly, trying to calm him down. She checked his food bowl. Full. Water bowl. Full. She touched his fur gently, worried he might be sick or injured, but the kitten pulled away again, still staring at the door with terrified eyes. Another cry escaped him, louder this time, echoing through the apartment walls. A moment later, Emily heard someone upstairs stomp across the floor. Then came a muffled voice from another apartment. "Can somebody shut that cat up?" Emily's face flushed with embarrassment and worry. She picked Oliver up again and wrapped him carefully inside a soft gray blanket, rocking him against her chest the way her mother used to calm frightened animals when she was little. For a few seconds, the kitten became still. Emily let out a relieved breath. But then Oliver suddenly lifted his head, stared past her shoulder toward the front door again, and released the most heartbreaking cry she had ever heard in her life. Tears instantly filled Emily's eyes. This wasn't normal crying. It sounded like grief, like fear, like the tiny kitten had lost something important and still believed it might come back. Emily sat frozen on the floor as Oliver continued trembling in her arms. Outside, rain tapped softly against the apartment windows while distant sirens echoed somewhere in the city. The clock on the microwave turned to 2:17 a.m., and for the first time since bringing Oliver home, Emily began to feel a deep, unsettling fear growing in her chest. Because no matter what she did, the kitten would not stop crying. By the time the sun finally rose over Chicago, Emily had not slept for even 10 minutes. She sat curled up on the living room floor in sweatpants and an oversized hoodie while Oliver remained near the front door, exhausted but still alert. Every few minutes, the tiny orange kitten released another weak cry that immediately tightened something deep inside her chest. The strange part was not just the crying itself. It was the way he behaved before each one. Oliver would suddenly freeze, stare toward the door, and tremble like he sensed something Emily could not see. Then the crying would begin again. Around 7:30 that morning, Emily tried feeding him fresh wet food from a small ceramic bowl she had bought the day before. Normally, kittens his age should have been energetic and curious, but Oliver barely reacted. He sniffed the food once and turned away. Emily frowned nervously. "Come on, buddy. You need to eat something." She dipped her finger into the food and gently held it near his mouth. After a few seconds, Oliver licked a tiny amount before slowly backing away again. Then he walked across the living room toward a small cardboard box sitting near the couch. Emily recognized it. Immediately, it was the same box the shelter volunteer had handed her during the adoption. Inside were a few old items that supposedly helped comfort rescued kittens during stressful transitions. A worn towel, a faded toy mouse, and a small cream-colored blanket with dark marks along the edges that looked slightly burned. Emily had not thought much about it before, but now she noticed Oliver climbing directly onto that blanket. The second his paws touched the fabric, his trembling eased slightly. Emily watched carefully. For the first time all night, the kitten seemed calmer. "Okay," she whispered quietly. "Maybe this helps you feel safe." She slowly reached down to pick up the blanket, intending to place it inside his bed near the heater. But the moment she lifted it from the floor, Oliver suddenly panicked. The tiny kitten let out a sharp cry and frantically pawed at the air toward the blanket. Emily immediately froze. Hey, it is okay." But Oliver kept crying. Louder now. Desperate. He pressed himself against her legs, trying to climb toward the blanket in her hands. Emily quickly lowered it back onto the floor, and within seconds, Oliver curled himself tightly against it again, breathing hard like he had just escaped something terrifying. Emily stared at the kitten in confusion. It was not normal attachment. It looked more like fear of losing the blanket itself. Later that afternoon, Emily called the shelter for answers. A tired woman named Rachel answered after several rings. "Hi," Emily said nervously. "I adopted a kitten named Oliver a few days ago. Orange tabby, blue collar." "Oh yes," Rachel replied softly. "Tiny little guy? How is he doing?" Emily hesitated. "Honestly, not great. He cries almost non-stop, especially at night. He barely eats, and he will not leave this old blanket alone." There was a strange pause on the other end of the phone, long enough for Emily to notice. "Rachel," she asked quietly, "is something wrong?" "No," the woman answered quickly, though her voice sounded uneasy now. "Some rescue kittens just take longer to adjust." Emily looked across the room at Oliver. The kitten had fallen asleep for the first time all day, curled tightly against the burned blanket while soft rain tapped against the apartment windows again. Even in his sleep, his tiny paws twitched nervously, and every few seconds, he made faint crying sounds under his breath. Emily swallowed hard as a terrible feeling settled deeper into her stomach. Because somehow, she knew this was more than separation anxiety. Something had happened to this kitten before she adopted him, and whatever it was, Oliver still seemed trapped inside it. Over the next 3 days, things only became worse. Oliver barely touched his food, and even when he did eat, it was only a few bites before he wandered back to the burned blanket near the couch. Emily tried different brands of kitten food from the pet store downstairs. Chicken, salmon, turkey pate. Nothing worked. The tiny kitten continued growing thinner, quieter during the day, and strangely distressed every night after sunset. What frightened Emily most was the pattern. Every evening, right around the same time, Oliver would suddenly become restless. He would pace across the apartment, stop near the front door, and stare at it for long stretches without moving. Then the crying started again. Loud, sharp, heartbroken. It echoed through the apartment walls like a tiny alarm no one knew how to shut off. By Thursday night, Emily looked completely exhausted. Dark circles had formed under her eyes from lack of sleep, and she jumped every time Oliver cried because each sound carried the same desperate fear she still could not explain. Around midnight, another loud knock hit her apartment door. Emily opened it to find her upstairs neighbor, Linda Brooks, standing in the hallway wearing a robe and slippers. Linda looked concerned, not angry. "Emily, honey, are you okay?" she asked softly. "I heard the kitten again." Emily sighed heavily and rubbed her forehead. "I do not know what is wrong with him. I have tried everything." Linda peeked inside and saw Oliver sitting near the door again, trembling slightly while clutching the blanket beneath his paws. "Poor little thing," Linda whispered. "Have you taken him to a vet yet?" Emily shook her head. "I made an appointment tomorrow morning." Linda nodded sympathetically before lowering her voice. "I had a rescue dog years ago that acted strangely after a house fire. Animals can carry fear longer than people realize." Emily felt her stomach tighten slightly at the mention of a fire. Before she could ask more, Oliver suddenly let out another painful cry from inside the apartment. Linda looked startled. "That does not sound normal," she admitted quietly. The next morning, Emily drove Oliver to a small veterinary clinic on the north side of the city. The entire ride there, the kitten stayed pressed tightly against the burned blanket inside his carrier. Every stoplight seemed to make him more anxious. Dr. Mason Reed greeted Emily with a calm smile as she entered the exam room. He was in his 40s with tired eyes and the kind of gentle voice that immediately made nervous pet owners feel slightly safer. "So this is Oliver," he said softly while opening the carrier. The moment Dr. Reed tried lifting him away from the blanket, Oliver panicked. The kitten cried loudly and clawed desperately back toward the fabric. Dr. Reed frowned. "Interesting. Emily explained everything. The crying, the fear, the sleepless nights, the strange attachment to the blanket. Dr. Reed listened carefully while examining Oliver from head to tail. After nearly 30 minutes, he stepped back thoughtfully. Physically, he looks okay, he finally said. His heartbeat is normal. Lungs sound clear. No fever. No visible injuries. Emily stared at him in disbelief. Then why is he acting like this? Dr. Reed hesitated for a moment before answering. Sometimes young rescue animals experience severe emotional stress after traumatic events, especially if they were separated suddenly from their environment. Emily looked down at Oliver, who had finally stopped crying but still refused to let go of the blanket beneath him. "Do you think he is scared?" she asked quietly. Dr. Reed exhaled slowly. "Honestly, I think this kitten is terrified of losing something." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" But before the veterinarian could answer, Oliver suddenly lifted his head and stared toward the exam room door. Then, just like every night before, he began crying again. That night, Emily tried everything she could think of to help Oliver feel safe. She moved his small cat bed closer to her bedroom. She left soft music playing quietly through her apartment speakers. She even wrapped a warm heating pad beneath the burned blanket after reading online that rescued kittens sometimes calmed down when they felt artificial warmth nearby. None of it worked. At exactly the same time as the night before, Oliver suddenly became restless again. He climbed out of the bed, walked slowly into the hallway, and stopped directly in front of the apartment door. Then he sat there perfectly still for nearly 30 seconds. Emily watched nervously from the couch. "Oliver," she whispered. The kitten did not move. His tiny ears twitched slightly as though he was listening for something beyond the door. Then came the crying again, louder than ever before. It echoed through the apartment so sharply that Emily physically flinched. The sound was heartbreaking, desperate, almost unbearable. She rushed toward him and picked him up carefully, but Oliver immediately struggled to get free, twisting frantically in her arms until she placed him back down. The moment his paws touched the floor, he ran straight back to the door and cried again. Emily stared at him in disbelief. "What are you looking for?" she whispered shakily. Her phone buzzed suddenly in her pocket. It was a text from Linda upstairs. "Is everything okay? The crying sounds worse tonight." Emily typed back quickly. "I do not know what is happening." A few seconds later, another message appeared. "Maybe he should go back to the shelter if he is this distressed." Emily read the message twice and felt guilt twist inside her stomach. The thought had crossed her mind earlier that day after leaving the veterinary clinic. What if her apartment was making things worse? What if Oliver needed specialized care she could not provide? She looked down at the tiny kitten crying near the door and immediately hated herself for even considering it. Oliver looked terrified, not aggressive. Broken, not dangerous. But the situation was becoming impossible. Emily had barely slept in days. She had missed work deadlines. Her neighbors were complaining. And worst of all, the kitten seemed to be getting emotionally worse instead of better. Around 1 a.m, Oliver finally stopped crying long enough to collapse beside the blanket near the couch. His breathing remained uneven, and even while resting, his eyes stayed half open as though he was afraid to fully relax. Emily sat quietly nearby, exhausted and emotionally drained. That was when she noticed something strange. Every single time Oliver settled down, one paw remained pressed tightly against the edge of the burned blanket, almost like he was afraid someone would take it away. Emily leaned closer. The blanket itself looked old and worn out, with several dark marks along one corner. She slowly lifted part of the fabric, studying it carefully beneath the living room lamp. The material smelled faintly like smoke. Not fresh smoke. Old smoke, embedded deep into the fibers. Emily frowned uneasily. Why would the shelter send a kitten home with something damaged like this? She gently turned the blanket over again, and that was when she noticed a tiny stitched area near the corner seam. It looked slightly thicker than the rest of the fabric, almost as if something had once been hidden inside it. Before she could inspect it further, Oliver suddenly woke up and let out another frightened cry. The kitten stumbled toward her immediately, clawing desperately at the blanket in her hands. Okay, Emily whispered quickly, placing it back down. Oliver instantly curled himself around it protectively, trembling as he buried his tiny face into the fabric. Emily stared at him for a long moment, her heartbeat slowly quickening. Because deep down, She no longer believed this was random trauma. Somehow, that blanket meant something important. And whatever the truth was, Oliver seemed terrified of losing the last piece of it. The next morning, Emily could not stop thinking about the blanket. Even while answering work emails from her kitchen table, her eyes kept drifting toward the couch, where Oliver slept curled tightly against the faded fabric. For the first time in days, the kitten seemed slightly calmer during daylight. Hours, but every few minutes his paws twitched nervously in his sleep, as though he was reliving something frightening. Emily quietly stood up and walked closer. The stitched corner she noticed the night before was still bothering her. It did not look accidental. The thread pattern was different from the rest of the blanket, almost like someone had sewn it shut in a hurry. Emily knelt beside Oliver carefully, making sure not to wake him. Then she gently lifted the edge of the blanket again. A faint smoky smell still lingered deep in the material. She swallowed uneasily. "What happened to you, little guy?" she whispered softly. Oliver stirred slightly, but did not wake up. Emily slowly reached for a small pair of sewing scissors from the nearby desk drawer. Her hands hesitated for a moment. Part of her felt guilty opening something that clearly mattered so much to the kitten. But another part of her knew the answer to Oliver's suffering might be hidden inside. Very carefully, she clipped a tiny section of loose thread near the seam. The fabric loosened immediately. Emily frowned. Something was definitely inside. She gently slid 2 fingers into the small opening and felt a folded piece of paper tucked deep between the layers of fabric. Her heartbeat quickened. Slowly, she pulled it out. The paper was badly wrinkled and smelled faintly like smoke. Emily unfolded it carefully, trying not to tear the fragile edges. At first, the handwriting was difficult to read. Some of the ink had smeared slightly, but one sentence immediately stood out. "Orange kitten found beside deceased mother after apartment fire." Emily froze completely. Her stomach dropped so suddenly that she had to sit back against the couch. For several seconds, she simply stared at the paper in silence while a cold wave of sadness moved through her chest. Oliver was not abandoned. He was not simply nervous from being rescued. The tiny kitten had survived something traumatic. And somehow, this blanket was connected to it. Emily looked down at Oliver again. The kitten remained asleep, curled tightly around the fabric as if protecting the last thing left in the world that still felt familiar to him. Tears slowly filled Emily's eyes. Suddenly, every strange behavior made sense. The crying, the fear at night, the panic whenever the blanket disappeared. Oliver was not attached to the blanket because it was comforting. He was attached to it because it was the final thing connected to someone he had lost. Emily pressed her hand gently against her mouth as emotion overwhelmed her. At that exact moment, her phone rang suddenly, making her jump. It was Dr. Mason Reed. Emily answered immediately. "Hello." "Hi, Emily," the veterinarian said calmly. "I was reviewing my notes from yesterday, and honestly, I could not stop thinking about Oliver." Emily looked down at the paper trembling in her hand. "Doctor, I think I found something." A short silence followed before she explained everything. The hidden note, the blanket, the mention of the apartment fire. Dr. Reed became very quiet. Then he sighed softly. "That explains a lot," he said. "Young animals can form extremely deep emotional bonds, especially with their mother during the first weeks of life." Emily swallowed hard. "Do you think he remembers her?" Dr. Reed paused before answering. "Not the way humans remember. But animals absolutely remember feelings. Smells. Warmth. Safety." Emily looked back toward Oliver as the tiny kitten suddenly twitched in his sleep again and released a faint, heartbreaking cry beneath his breath. And in that moment, Emily finally realized something devastating. Oliver had not been crying because he was sick. He had been crying because he was grieving. Emily sat in complete silence after the phone call ended. Outside her apartment window, the gray Chicago sky had darkened again, and soft rain slid slowly down the glass. Oliver remained asleep beside the blanket, unaware that the truth behind his strange behavior had finally been uncovered. Emily could not stop staring at him. Just a few days earlier, she had believed she was adopting a shy rescue kitten that simply needed time to adjust. Now she realized she had brought home a tiny animal carrying fear, confusion, and loss far bigger than anyone understood. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed again. Another message from Dr. Mason Reed appeared on the screen. "There is something else you should know." Emily immediately called him back. "Doctor," she said quietly, Dr. Reed sounded thoughtful this time, almost careful with his words. I contacted the shelter after we spoke, he explained. One of the volunteers remembered Oliver's rescue. Emily held her breath. What happened? There was a short pause before he answered. Apparently, firefighters found him hidden underneath part of a collapsed kitchen cabinet after the apartment fire. His mother was beside him the entire time. Emily closed her eyes instantly as emotion hit her chest again. Dr. Reed continued gently. The volunteers said Oliver would not stop crying after they separated him from her. They tried feeding him, warming him, even placing him with other kittens, but nothing worked. Emily looked across the room at the tiny orange kitten sleeping against the blanket. Suddenly, his behavior no longer felt strange at all. It felt heartbreakingly understandable. That blanket, Emily whispered softly. It probably still smells like her. Exactly, Dr. Reed replied. For humans, memories are often visual. For animals, especially kittens that young, memory is strongly connected to scent, warmth, and sound. That blanket may be the only thing left in the world that still feels like safety to him. Emily swallowed hard as tears slowly filled her eyes again. Every cry, every sleepless night, every moment Oliver sat staring at the door. He had not been waiting for danger. He had been waiting for comfort to come back. Waiting for the one thing that once made him feel safe. I thought something was wrong with him, Emily admitted quietly. Dr. Reed's voice softened immediately. Nothing is wrong with him, Emily. He is grieving. The word hit her harder than anything else. Grieving. Not broken. Not aggressive. Not unstable. Just heartbroken in the only way a tiny animal knew how to express. Emily slowly walked toward the couch and knelt beside Oliver again. The kitten stirred slightly in his sleep, pressing his face deeper into the blanket as another faint cry escaped him. This time, instead of fear, Emily felt overwhelming sadness. She gently rested one hand beside him on the blanket. You miss her, she whispered quietly. Oliver slowly opened his eyes. For a brief moment, the kitten looked confused, almost frightened again. Then Emily carefully moved closer and rested her hand lightly against his tiny back. You are safe now, she said softly. Oliver stared at her silently. Then, for the first time since she adopted him, the kitten did something different. Instead of running toward the door or crying out in panic, he slowly crawled forward and pressed his tiny body against Emily's arm. The movement was small, fragile, but it shattered something inside her emotionally. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she carefully wrapped the blanket around him again. Oliver closed his eyes almost immediately, still trembling slightly, but this time he stayed close to her instead of the door. Emily sat there with him for nearly an hour while rain tapped quietly against the apartment windows and the city outside slowly disappeared into evening darkness. And in that quiet moment, she made herself a promise. Oliver was never going to feel alone again. The next few days slowly began to change inside Emily's apartment. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, quiet ways that almost felt fragile. Emily started keeping Oliver close to her as much as possible. When she worked at the kitchen table, she placed the burned blanket beside her chair so the kitten could sleep nearby. At night, instead of leaving him alone in the living room, she carried his small bed into her bedroom and rested it beside her own. The first night she did this, Oliver still cried after midnight. But this time, when Emily gently reached down and rested her fingers against his tiny back, the crying stopped sooner than before. Dr. Reed had also given her another suggestion. Earlier that afternoon, Emily stopped by a pet supply store and bought a small heartbeat pillow designed for rescue kittens. The pillow created a soft, rhythmic vibration that mimicked the sound of another living heartbeat nearby. Emily was skeptical at first, but the moment she tucked it beneath the burned blanket, Oliver reacted immediately. The tiny kitten froze, staring down at the blanket with wide eyes. Then slowly, carefully, he lowered himself against it. For the first time since she adopted him, Emily heard something other than crying. A faint purring sound. It lasted only a few seconds, but it nearly brought tears back to her eyes. That is it, she whispered softly. You are okay. Oliver still startled easily at sudden sounds, especially at night. Sometimes he woke up crying and ran toward the apartment door again as though searching for someone who was never coming back. But now, instead of panicking alone, he always turned back toward Emily after a few moments. And every single time, she was there waiting for him. One rainy evening, Emily sat cross-legged on the floor beside the couch while Oliver slept against her leg. The apartment finally felt quiet again after nearly a week of sleepless nights and emotional exhaustion. She gently stroked the kitten's tiny orange fur while television lights flickered softly across the room. Then her phone buzzed with another message from Linda upstairs. "How is the little guy doing?" Emily smiled faintly before replying. "Better. I finally understand why he was crying." A few seconds later, Linda sent back a heart emoji followed by, "Animals feel lost too." Emily looked down at Oliver after reading the message. The kitten had become so attached to her over the last few days that he now followed her from room to room whenever he was awake. Earlier that morning, she had gone into the laundry room for less than 2 minutes, and Oliver sat outside the door crying softly until she came back. But now the crying sounded different. Less desperate, less terrified, more like reassurance that she was still there. Emily realized something important then. Oliver was beginning to trust again. Late that night, Emily woke up suddenly and reached toward the floor beside her bed where Oliver usually slept. For a brief second, panic flashed through her chest when she did not feel him there. Then she heard the faintest purring sound near her pillow. Emily opened her eyes slowly and froze. Oliver was curled tightly against her chest beneath the blanket, sleeping peacefully for the first time since coming home. His tiny paws rested against her sweatshirt, and the heartbeat pillow lay tucked beside him. Emily stared down at the kitten in disbelief as emotion filled her throat. Just a few nights earlier, he had spent hours crying at the apartment door, trembling with fear and grief. Now he was sleeping beside her quietly, finally beginning to feel safe again. Emily gently brushed her fingers across the top of his head, careful not to wake him. Oliver barely stirred. He simply pressed closer against her and continued sleeping peacefully in her arms while soft rain tapped against the windows outside. And in that quiet moment, Emily realized something she would never forget for the rest of her life. Sometimes healing does not begin when the pain disappears. Sometimes healing begins the moment someone finally stops facing that pain alone. Over the following weeks, Oliver slowly began transforming into a completely different kitten. The frightened little animal who once cried through the night now spent his mornings curled beside Emily on the couch, while sunlight poured softly through the apartment windows. The changes were small at first. One morning, Emily noticed he finished an entire bowl of food without hesitation. Another day, he chased a toy mouse across the living room for nearly 10 minutes before collapsing onto the carpet in exhaustion. Each tiny improvement felt enormous to her. But even as Oliver healed, Emily never removed the burned blanket from his side. She washed it carefully by hand one afternoon, terrified the scent might disappear completely. While it dried near the heater, Oliver paced nervously through the apartment searching for it until Emily finally wrapped him gently in a clean towel and sat beside him on the floor. "I know," she whispered softly as the kitten trembled against her chest. "You are afraid it will disappear too." That night, she made another change. Emily placed the blanket inside a soft round pet bed beside her own bed and tucked the heartbeat pillow beneath it again. Oliver climbed inside slowly, circled twice, then curled up directly in the center. Within minutes, the tiny purring sound returned. This time it lasted longer than ever before. Emily smiled through tears as she listened to it in the darkness. A few days later, Dr. Mason Reed invited Emily to stop by the clinic for a quick follow-up visit. The moment Oliver arrived, the veterinarian noticed the difference immediately. "Well," he said with a warm smile while gently scratching beneath the kitten's chin, "this is not the same terrified little guy I met last week." Emily laughed softly for the first time in days. "He still gets nervous sometimes," she admitted, "especially at night. But he is finally sleeping." Dr. Reed nodded thoughtfully while watching Oliver rub against Emily's arm. "Animals heal through consistency," he explained. "Safety repeated over time becomes trust." Emily looked down at the kitten as he climbed into her lap without hesitation. "I think he finally believes someone is staying," she whispered quietly. Later that evening, Emily returned home carrying a small framed photo the shelter had printed for her before she left. It showed Oliver on the day he was rescued, tiny and frightened beneath layers of blankets, while a firefighter held him carefully in gloved hands. Emily stared at the picture for a long moment after placing it on the bookshelf near the couch. It broke her heart all over again, imagining how scared he must have been. As if sensing her sadness, Oliver jumped onto the couch beside her and gently pressed his tiny head against her arm. Emily smiled softly and stroked his fur. "You do not have to be scared anymore," she whispered. Outside, another storm rolled across Chicago that night. Rain hit the apartment windows while distant thunder echoed across the city skyline. A week earlier, sounds like that would have sent Oliver spiraling into panic. But this time, something different happened. The kitten lifted his head once at the sound of thunder, ears twitching nervously. Then instead of crying or running toward the door, he climbed directly into Emily's lap and curled tightly against her chest beneath the blanket. Emily wrapped her arms around him gently while his tiny heartbeat thumped steadily against her sweater. After a few quiet minutes, the purring began again. Stronger now. Steadier. Safe. Emily closed her eyes as emotion filled her chest once more. She realized then that healing had not erased Oliver's pain. The memories were probably still there somewhere inside him. But now, alongside those memories, there was something else too. Warmth. Safety. Love. And for the first time since the night she brought him home, the apartment no longer felt filled with sadness. It finally felt like home for both of them. 3 months later, Emily woke up early on a quiet Sunday morning to the soft sound of purring beside her face. Sunlight streamed gently through the apartment windows, filling the bedroom with warm golden light. She opened her eyes slowly and smiled almost instantly. Oliver was stretched across her chest, completely asleep, one tiny paw resting against her shoulder while his steady purring vibrated softly through the blanket between them. Emily lay still for a moment, simply watching him breathe. It was hard to believe this was the same frightened kitten who once spent entire nights crying beside the apartment door. Now Oliver followed her everywhere with quiet confidence. He waited beside the bathroom every morning while she got ready for work. He sat at the kitchen counter while she cooked dinner. And every night, without fail, he climbed into bed beside her and fell asleep curled safely against her side. The burned blanket still remained near his favorite spot on the couch. Emily never moved it far away. Sometimes Oliver still slept on it during thunderstorms or particularly cold nights, but he no longer clung to it with panic the way he once had. It had become a comfort instead of a lifeline. Later that afternoon, Emily invited Linda upstairs down for coffee. The moment Linda walked into the apartment, Oliver trotted happily across the living room and rubbed against her legs. Linda gasped softly. "Oh my goodness," she laughed. "This cannot be the same kitten." Emily smiled warmly as she watched Oliver chase a small toy ball across the floor. "I know," she said quietly. "Sometimes I still cannot believe it either." Linda sat down on the couch and glanced toward the old blanket folded neatly beside the window. "You kept it?" she noticed gently. Emily nodded. "I think part of him will always need it." Oliver suddenly jumped onto the couch between them and curled into a tiny orange circle beneath the sunlight. Linda looked down at him for a long moment before speaking again. "You saved him, Emily." Emily shook her head immediately. "No," she whispered softly. "I think he just needed someone who understood why he was hurting." That evening, after Linda left, Emily found herself standing quietly near the bookshelf, staring once more at the framed rescue photo from the shelter. The image still broke her heart every time she looked at it. Such a tiny kitten, so frightened, so alone. But then she felt something brush gently against her ankle. Oliver looked